Hi everyone, welcome to A Centre of Light. We're going to be introducing in a few moments a wonderful author who's written a succession of fascinating books, which we really want to get out there, and I know other people have been doing that. Um, Also, we're going to talk a lot about his work today, just to sort of delve into it more deeply because so much material there, so much to all kinds of people out there. So, just first, before we start, just to let you know, if you don't know already about the Centre of Light, we're a spiritual organization and business. We act as spiritual mentors or facilitators, helping others in spiritual development. Now, we believe that we're all our own centers of light, learning from and supporting each other, which is where the element of facilitating comes in. Now, we like to call this a democracy of spirit, which discourages the power control of hierarchy and encourages well-being. Now, one thing, Laird, that I will be asking you in a while is about that sort of issue of hierarchy in society, because having read your work, um, it was quite interesting that the Dogon do have that element of hierarchy in terms of their initiates or their priests and those on the outside. So I'll ask you a little bit about that in a moment. But before we start, one thing I did want to say to you, Led, was that what really drew us to you. Can you hear me okay, Led?
Yeah, yes, a little spotty, but I'm getting the gist of what you're saying.
Okay. Anything you want me to repeat, just say. Okay. Um, we led as an organisation. Part of what we do is we channel information. Now, some of the information that we channeled um, was very much linked to the type of work that you do and the type of work that you talk about, and that's what really sort of caused us to have to share um, what it was that you had in terms of your work. If I can just sort of give an example, now we've been channeling for a number of years, and it was 2 months ago that we came across your work. One of the things, for example, was we work with the pyramid. Um, we talk about pillars, and that was kind of mentioned in your work, and just talk about the elements, and also with regard to a centre of light, where that came from was with the pyramid and what it means, which is fire in the middle, or what we call central fire, and that is the centre of light, and that's where we sort of talk about everybody being their own centre of light. Now, what fascinated me about the phrase that you used in, I think it was Seeking the Primordial, was the expression family of four principal categories. Now, you may or may not agree, but that kind of premise reminded me of the earth, air, fire, and water sort of type of approach. But
Yes,
that,
absolutely.
yes, that they were all essential to each other. You could not do any of them. And that's what also formed part of their unity. Now, the other thing that we took from your work, something that we have called openness, awareness, and love. Now, if you imagine a triangle, you've got love at the top, and then two bottom ends, you've got openness and you've got awareness. Now, that is very much similar to what you talk about controlling energy. To the top point, which kind of it reminded me when you spoke about the dipole. I thought, well, there sounds like elements there as well as in terms of similarity. What we also want to talk about today, the issue and theme of connectivity, because a lot of us have been going around with masks, gloves, we've been doing social distancing, we've been staying at home, all of that, which issues about communication and the ability to connect with each other. Now, that's also raised issues or problems such as I have with information technology. And that's been my issue in terms of connecting with the world at the moment, grappling with information technology. I just wondered, like, just to sort of open this up, what kind of issues have you had yourself since this whole COVID-19 began?
Well, most of my work, the research work I do and the writing that I do from my home. So I am probably least impacted of many of the people I know by lockdown.
Right.
I joked at first, does this mean that I'm now going to have to do all my research and all my writing from home?
Yeah.
So those issues I haven't had. Trying to connect to people through the internet is something that relates to my work sort of inherently anyway, because that's the best way to try to connect to people about to many people at one time about a set of concepts. Also, the nature of my book is my work is to write a book, which is a little like putting a message in a bottle and tossing it into the ocean. Quite often, I don't get a response back from the people that I'm communicating with. So this is all sort of part and parcel of normal work for me.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
Now, in terms of channeling, I am in daily contact with people who routinely channel things that connect directly to what I'm writing, as recently as this morning. So depending on the level and the type of sensitivity of the person that I'm in contact with, it's very common to see my own work coming back at me through the dreams or through the channeled methods of the people that I am in contact with.
Right, right. So it's not something which is unfamiliar to you then, it's something you can identify with through the fact that you've come across this before.
Right, very frequently, yes.
Right, right. You were talking just a moment ago about your work. Then, I think would be really helpful, because there's a lot of people out there who know your work, but there's also a lot of people who perhaps don't. So I just wondered, could you just give a summary of what it is that you have done in terms of your research, and just let us know about that? And also, if we could know a little bit about your new book, which you put out, which is called Primal Wisdom of the Ancients.
Yes, well, at the simplest level, what I try to do is I'm attempting to learn more about ancient symbols, myths, symbolic themes, rituals, language, by comparing how different ancient cultures each understood the same element. I'm essentially triangulating in on an original meaning by comparing how a variety of different cultures or traditions understood the same symbol or symbolic element. And these traditions include, they begin for me with an African tribe, a modern day African tribe called the Dogon, who are from Mali, which sits in the northwest hump of Africa. Right. This is a modern day primitive African tribe, with no access to technology, located distantly across the desert from most things we would consider to be civilized. Right. Their culture serves as a kind of umbrella over at least three ancient traditions. They have civic traditions like ancient Egypt at around 3000 BC. They have rituals similar to ancient Judaism at about that same era. And they have a symbolic cosmology that is very closely matched to a Buddhist cosmology associated with a stupa shrine, if you know what that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Dogon, as it turns out, make an excellent entry point to this kind of comparative study, because they have elements of many different traditions enfolded underneath the umbrella of one culture. And they have living priests who have a good understanding of their own symbols and their own word meanings, their own ritual meanings, and so forth. So it's an excellent starting point. It's sort of an objective starting point. Probably the greatest threat to the work I do is my own wishfulness. The human brain is wired to see patterns even where they don't exist. Anyone who has ever, as a child, looked up at clouds in the sky and inferred that there were animal shapes or shapes of other things, understands that this concept, the brain is framed in a way that it's trying to make sense out of what it sees. And so in my field of study, that's dangerous, because it's very easy to think that there is meaning to something when there's not. Yeah. So my first rule to protect against that is that interpretations begin with one of the ancient cultures. I ideally want to begin with a flat statement, a clear statement on the part of an ancient culture as the starting point for any interpretation. And then my job becomes one of pursuing that and verifying it and testing the reasonableness of it, seeing how other cultures understood the same concept and trying to sort of narrow in on what the original meaning of that aspect was.
Yes, yeah. Actually, that is fascinating because there was one point that you did make with regard to how we understand ancient culture. And that was that these teachings were given to a lot of the tribes by special teachers, possibly even from the in a moment, but the non-material realm. And these teachers came and they taught them like the art of agriculture, weaving, and so on. And a lot of the academic community, and probably a lot of people in general, tend to think, well, okay, that was just a story that they liked to believe to justify where they got that from. So you, I believe, kind of asked, well, surely we have to test that if all the cultures are saying the same thing. Is that correct?
Yes, on a manuscript I've been recently working on, I quote a traditional academic researcher who studies the Near East, cultures in the Near East, ancient cultures. And he makes a statement that he has never yet come across an ancient culture that didn't make some kind of a claim for instruction in ancient times from somebody more knowledgeable than themselves.
Yeah.
But then he takes the next step beyond that. He says, and it's well past time that we set all of that nonsense aside.
Yeah.
Well, my point of view is I understand that by metaphor, if we think a 4-year-old child is an unreliable witness, that's true. Inherently, a 4-year-old child can't be trusted to tell us the truth about a situation. However, when we have a group of 4-year-old children all independently telling us the same thing about a situation, it rises to the level of corroborated testimony. And that's where we sit with ancient cultures, that when very many of them are telling us the same thing, what we might interpret as nonsense on the part of one of them rises to the level of testimony that we need to corroborate when they're all saying the same thing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Something I'd like to ask you about is the difference in your books between the non-material and the material led. And that's because a lot of people who we know of through a Center of Light are spiritualists. Now, they work with the invisible realm of people who pass over to the other side. So, in other words, that's their version of the non-material. I just wondered how the spiritualists understand, the material and the non-material, those who are here and those who pass over, is the same as your understanding in your books? Or do you have a different understanding of material and non-material?
First off, every term that's important to this symbolic tradition carries a cluster of meanings, not a single meaning. That's one of the ways I'm able to correlate meaning between cultures, sometimes even between different languages, because these clusters of meanings hold true in different contexts. And to give you an example, the same cluster of meanings that we find associated with a phonetic value in an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, we also see play out routinely in vivid dreams, or we see play out in terms of psychiatric reports of UFO encounters. We see the same clusters of meanings appear again and again and again. These are sets that belong together.
Yeah.
So my sense of non-materiality, this is a complicated subject. I'll try to explain to you how the tradition that I'm working with represents it, and then you can compare that to your own understanding. My process begins with it rests on a philosophy called Samkhya that comes out of India. Samkhya is a companion to yoga, and it's an ancient philosophy that is the underpinning of classical religious traditions throughout India.
Right.
To my way of thinking, it's also the underpinning of the Dogon cosmology. Now, Samkhya says that universes form in pairs, one non-material and the other material.
Yeah.
And that there is a cycle of energy that flows between those universes that is as essential to life in the universes as the natural water cycle is to life on our planet.
Yeah.
The natural water cycle, of course, is the cycle in which water evaporates from the oceans to form clouds, which then rise up over the mountains, drop rain that then flows back to the ocean. Without that cycle of water, we would have no life on the earth. The Dogon and Samkhya are saying that without that, the cycle of energy that flows between these two pairs of universes, that we wouldn't have life in the universe.
Right.
Now, it's not simply energy that's scrolling between these universes. It's energy and mass. And the fact that it's energy and mass makes a difference. Einstein tells us that when a thing becomes more massive, time slows down for it. That's at the heart of Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared. The implication is that as mass increases, which is the equivalent of acceleration increasing,
yeah,
that time frame slows down. It's the only way that light is able to maintain a constant speed in relation to us.
Right.
An example Einstein gave was if you were chasing a train in an automobile and you sped up, you would expect that the difference in speed between you and the train would become smaller.
Yep.
That's not true with light. No matter how much we speed up chasing light, we will always measure light at the same speed ahead of us as we always have. So the only way that works mathematically is if the rate of time slows down.
Right.
So the essential difference between the non-material domain and the material domain is one of quickness of time frame, relative quickness of time frame. Now, from our perspective, let's imagine that we're in what I see right now as a fully material universe. We're at the end of a cycle from my point of view.
Right.
The companion universe that's with us is at the other opposite end of that spectrum. They're at the least material phase they can be at, which implies that their time frame runs ultra quickly compared to our time frame. Now, if you've ever watched time-lapse photography of traffic on a street, you've noticed that after you reach a certain point, you no longer see individual cars, you see a stream of cars. If you were to watch time-lapse photography of a highway at night, you would no longer see individual cars, you would see a stream of lights.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, anything that sits in that quick a time frame looks like unity to us.
Right.
However, that continuum of mass and time frame, where mass increases and time slows, or mass decreases and time quickens, it's continuous. There's no opportunity along that continuum for the dynamic to change, which implies that for the consciousness that's in that state, there may not be much of a difference between unity and multiplicity.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, now if we imagine that a particle of matter, if we conceive of that as an individualized segment of mass, a primordial mass of waves, the Dogon see parallelism between biology and matter and the formation of matter. They see one dynamic of energy that controls biology, that controls how matter forms, and controls how the universes form. Right. And so for them, parallelism implies that individualized consciousness may be to a grand source of consciousness in the same relationship that an individualized particle is to a grand source of matter.
Yep.
Or energy.
Yep.
Okay, so we can imagine if the essential difference between those two domains is just quickness of time frame, that even though it looks to us as if there's only one grand consciousness on the non-material side, there still could be individuation of consciousness there.
Yep.
Now, essentially, that's the concept that explains quantum entanglement of particles, where scientists are able to induce, say, two electrons to connect with each other in a way so that anything that happens to one instantaneously affects what happens to the other, no matter the distance between the two electrons.
Yeah.
You can separate them by hundreds of miles, and if you change an attribute of one electron, you instantaneously change the attribute of the other.
Yeah.
Well, I see that as a function of time frame. A recent study was done where scientists measured the difference in time it took those interactions to happen between entangled particles and the same particles unentangled. And they discovered that entanglement is 10,000 times quicker than unentanglement.
Right.
So in that study is suggesting that the essential difference here is quickness of how quickly things happen, not much else.
Right. Right.
So
Interesting...
to me, okay.
No, Ned, carry on, Ned, please, carry on.
So with time frame being that essential difference, as I said, it provides a framework in which we can imagine that individualized consciousness still exists, even though it looks to us from a distance as if it were unity. Now, there's a boundary between non-materiality and materiality that's best exemplified by white light producing a rainbow of colors, or by a single tone evoking 7 musical notes.
Yeah.
That is the essential dynamic of anything that crosses that boundary from non-materiality to materiality.
Yes.
The Dogen, the Buddhists, and others are representing that everything essential to us materially really the roots of those things really exist non-materially. They persist non-materially, not materially. In the same way that the television program that you might stream onto your television set doesn't reside in your television set, it resides elsewhere.
Yeah.
So the perspective is that everything essential resides somewhere elsewhere than where we are.
Yes.
And so when something appears to end to us, it's the same as a television episode ending on your television set. Nothing has really ended. Nothing has really disappeared or changed. It's just we're no longer able to access it the way we accessed it.
Yes, yes. One thing, as you were talking, I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned in your work that according to Samkhya philosophy, which you say is perhaps the side of yoga, you mentioned about 14 universes, 7 material universes and 7 non-material universes, and we are at about the 4th stage of that succession. I was just wondering, just a thought this moment, I wonder what those other universes look like then.
You have cut out, so I missed the end of that sentence. From the point where you said, I wonder.
I was just wondering, as you were speaking about these other universes, we are sort of at the 4th stage of this set of universes. What do those other universes look like?
Well, okay, if we imagine, okay, I guess this is difficult to explain. The dynamic by which universes form, I have to rewind a little more here. I'm ahead of myself. The Dogen represent that there are a handful of dynamics of energy that everything is based on, and these dynamics play out in parallel form on all upward scales from the quantum world on up. So there's parallelism from one to the next. That's very important because what it means is that anytime we're in a posture where we can't directly observe a thing, knowing that there's parallelism, we can infer from what we can observe what the situation must be with the thing that we can't observe.
Right.
So in the Dogen parallel mindset, the dynamic that creates universes is the same dynamic that creates dimensions. So our posturing as the fourth of 7 universes has parallelism to the idea of us being experiencing 4 dimensions.
Right.
So there's dimensionality inherently involved here. When the Dogen are talking about universes, they may actually be talking about what we consider to be dimensionality.
Right. Right.
Now, they actually also bring us down to root concepts of how dimensionality forms. Actually, I now understand that the next book I'll write, following the one that I'm finishing right now, will talk about the root dynamics of energy that differentiate non-materiality from materiality and that create the dimensionality that we see, down to concepts of time. There was a study that came out this week about the true nature of time, that it may rest on subtle oscillations of energy that happen at a primordial level. This is what the Dogen have represented. It's a concept I've written about, but science is now finding evidence to say that's actually what the truth is, that there is a persistent oscillation of energy, like the beating of a heart, that essentially counts out the moments of time.
Right. Right. Carry on.
I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
Yes, absolutely. So I thought you could say something else. I wanted to just dwell a little bit longer, if I could, on this material and non-material, because I do think it's fascinating. In trying to sort of understand it, when I was reading your work, the immediate image that I had was one of a large circle. So at the top of the circle, perhaps, let's say let me think about this, anti-clockwise, it would descend from one side, from a state of non-material, descending down towards the material till it gets to the bottom, and then from the material, it would ascend up to the non-material. So that was the simplest way that I could understand it. But one of the things that also came to mind was the figure of 8, which is also a spiritual sign or glyph or whatever, because the figure of 8 gives that suggestion of circling around from one side to the other side of the 8, if you know what I mean, which kind of reminds me of what you say about the material and the non-material working together with each other. Would that be a fair understanding or assessment of that?
that could well be, because this comes down to concepts of symmetry of particles of matter, that both the Dogen and modern scientists, modern astrophysicists, understand that there are hundreds of fundamental particles. Stephen Hawking says there are more than 200 fundamental particles. The Dogen say there are 266. Now, they classify, each group, the Dogen and Hawking, classify these particles according to the types of symmetry they exhibit. There's one group of particles that is like a circle that looks the same from every side. There's another class of particle that's like a double-headed arrow that has to be turned around halfway in order to look the same. There's another class of particles that looks like a single-headed arrow that has to be turned all the way around to look the same. And there's a fourth class of particle called the half-spin particles that actually has to be turned around twice in order to look the same. Now, the idea that something has to be turned around twice to look the same is counterintuitive to us in our experience. We shouldn't have to do that. But that's the class of particles that has the potential to point us to the presence of an unseen domain.
Yeah.
We can imagine that this type of particle, this includes electrons and protons, that this kind of particle passes into a blind spot and then back out of that blind spot. And so we have, in what looks to us as turning it around once, all we've done is moved it into the blind spot. And turning it around the second time, we move it back out of the blind spot, and now we have it in the original orientation again. Now, it occurred to me several years back to ask a question. Could there be geometry associated with that kind of a particle? Because there are many structures relating to the formation of matter and of life that can be represented geometrically or that have geometry associated with them. When I pursued that, what I discovered was the geometry of these half-spin particles is the same geometry that Buddhists use to align a stupa shrine. This is the initial exercise that's taught to a Buddhist initiate, is they're required to memorize a sequence of geometric shapes, a progression of geometric shapes that are laid out in a field that allow them to automatically align a shrine to the cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. That geometry begins with a stick placed vertically in a field and a circle measured out, a radius measured out from that stick, and then a circle drawn around the stick based on that radius. That essentially provides us with the figure of a sundial. A sundial is a tool that allows us to measure time in a material frame. It's linear time. It's the time as measured by the face of a clock. It's measured in what the Dogen call moments, or what the Dogen call, actually what the Dogen call glimpses. Okay, beginning with that figure, an initiate every day plots the two longest shadows cast by the stick when the sun shines on it. This would be the first shadow of the morning and the last shadow of the evening, and the initiate marks the points on the circle where that shadow intersects. Now, because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, those points are automatically aligned east and west. And so if you imagine those being the points of a line and drawing a line between them and doing that every day, because of the way seasonality works, we would see that line shift. It would shift away from the center of the circle to outward until the date of the solstice, and then it would shift back towards the center of the circle, pass through it on the equinox, and continue to shift until the date of the next solstice. So we have an oscillation back and forth, which is the measure of time non-materially. Yeah. So the figure is not only representative of these half-spin particles, it also reconciles the two modes of time, linear time that we experience materially and an oscillation of time that's experienced non-materially. Yeah. Beyond that, the Buddhists say that these figures recapitulate how space actually emerges. Now, the next phase of the geometry is to use those two endpoints of that line, adopt them as centers of two more circles of slightly larger radius, and draw circles around them. And when we do that, we produce an overlap in the center. That overlap is almond-shaped, and the points of the almond are directionally aligned north and south. That almond space in the center is where the concept of the Vesica Pisces arises. It represents an overlap between space that the Dogen and Samkhya say exists at every point in space and time.
Right.
And within that overlap of space is where laws of physics and time as we understand them break down. Right. It's where entanglement of particles happens. That if you can induce two electrons to connect with each other within that space, you entangle them. And as soon as anything else happens to those electrons, they unentangle.
Right.
Now that same space, that Vesica Pisces space, that overlap space, is treated as a gateway between non-materiality and materiality. It's the gateway through which the cycle of energy scrolls from the non-material side to the material side. And within that space, the energy is being configured in particular ways that determine what the material forms are going to look like. Now, when we talk about stages and processes of material creation, every single aspect of that process is subject to change over time, except that gateway. And so that gateway is assigned a term in Buddhism. The term is Dhatu. And Dhatu is the root of the word deity. And deity, from the Buddhist perspective, originally referred to the aspect of the structure that never changes. So I'm just now learning details of what transpires within that that overlap space, which is very interesting. It boils down to, again, root dynamics of what energy does naturally. If we have two streams of energy of different quality, we can illustrate this with streams of water, or we can illustrate it with streams of energy. Two streams of energy of different quality, when they come together, tend to spin. And the way they come together is in the shape, that same almond shape of the Vesica Pisces. That almond shape becomes the center point of the spinning energy. Now, the energies coming together is a dynamic of energy called angular impulse. It's the crisscrossing shape. I'm not sure if you've ever seen a diagram of the orbit of the moon around the Earth. If you take into account the motion of the two bodies through space, you're not seeing a simple circular motion. You're seeing a crisscrossing motion. And that crisscrossing motion is angular impulse. It's what energy naturally does when it moves, especially when you have more than one quality of energy. Right. Now, the spinning energy is a dynamic called angular momentum. Einstein says that angular momentum evokes mass. And when you evoke mass, there are some consequences. You're also evoking, at certain points, you're creating an oscillation that creates resonance. We're all familiar with musical resonance. If you find two musical notes that are close enough together, they're going to hear a vibration. You're going to feel a vibration. Or if you do it in the right space, you feel a vibration of resonance. Resonance creates resistance, and resistance essentially is mass. Eventually, that resistance builds up to the point that it has to be relieved, and the relief of that resistance is the emitting of a vector in a plane perpendicular to the spinning energy. And the energy is evoked from the center point of the energy, but depending on how much resistance there is, the vector can go in different directions in that plane that sits perpendicularly to the spinning energy. It fans out, essentially. And science defines 7 vectors, the same as the Dogen do, 7 vectors that are emitted from that center point of the spinning energy. And the centermost vector is what we experience as linear time. Essentially, the oscillation of time that exists non-materially gets translated by that spinning and that evoking of vectors into a vector of time that is what we experience.
Right.
I'm not sure how far afield I've moved from your original question.
No, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. One thing, can you hear me? You've frozen. Can you hear me okay?
I have you periodically freezing mid-sentence, but I'm able to pick up on most of what you're saying.
Oh, great. I want to talk, I would like to ask you about what we perhaps could call universal language. Now, it's as old as humankind, I would imagine, this belief that there's a language which united all people on the globe.
Okay, you've frozen, but I'm understanding that you're asking about how old the symbolic tradition is.
Well, yeah, it's just, I'm talking about universal language. It's been called, in occult circles, I think it's called lost speech. And ever since then, we've been trying to recover it. I mean, in your way, through your research, you're doing a similar thing. You're trying to recover a language. It maybe was, a unified language. It was the same language that existed everywhere. And what you have been doing, as far as I can understand, is I think you use the term triangulation. When you use perhaps Egyptian, Buddhist, and Judaic signs and symbols and language to understand the Dogon language. And that's because you believe at bottom there is a unifying language beneath them all, that you're trying to ferret out, if you like. Is that what you're trying to do?
At the root level, at the point where I began looking into this, all I was trying to understand was how the Dogon could possibly know some subtle facts about science that they shouldn't be able to know, given their lack of technology. Ultimately, what I'm doing, what I've discovered is, or what I see is, that all of these ancient traditions are preserving elements of what an original system, an original symbolic system. Some of them are flatly representing it that way. The Buddhists and the Dogon, among others, are flatly saying, we're looking at an instructed tradition that in very ancient times, someone who understood all the science put together, deliberately imparted a civilizing plan for humanity that was closely tagged to this symbolic creation tradition, symbolic cosmology. There's a mnemonic relationship that the structures of society that were being created for humanity are being taught, introduced to us, were patterned after actual structures that relate to this system of creation, so that when a Dogon tribesperson goes to plow his field, he does it in a way that recreates the process of creation. And or when a Dogon tribesperson weaves a cloth or spins thread or creates pottery or any number of other actions of daily life, the idea was that every act of daily life would help to reinforce this instructed tradition. My most recent book, Primal Wisdom of the Ancients, was an opportunity for me to talk about all of these different aspects of the system that reveal the hand of a very capable set of teachers. There are techniques being used that it might not be obvious on the surface, but someone who is very much a stickler for consistency put together a system that is predictable, has predictability to it, and that has sense to it. This is not a random assemblage of symbols. This is a very carefully considered set of symbols that work in a very particular set of ways.
Yep.
So from my point of view, it's this instruction, this ancient era of instruction, which we see as being original to the tradition. The Egyptians call that the first time. The Buddhists refer to it as the first time knowledge was passed to humanity by a Buddha. The Dogon refer to it as the time when culture was restored to humanity. And so the Dogon perspective implies that this is not the first cycle in which we have been through this process, that this is a restoration of knowledge that has existed previously.
Right. Right. It reminds me of when they talk in the Bible about the times before the flood and after the flood. It's like completely different times. It's sort of like perhaps that's a symbol of that. Something I also wanted to ask you about, Led, was something I touched on at the start, and that was about a sense of hierarchy. Now, from what I've read so far, I've more to read, a lot more to read, and look forward to it. But what I've read so far talks about the sort of something which a lot of people talk about, and that's conspiracy theories and so on about elites that control society. Okay, in other words, there's a circle of those who know, and there are those. Is it cutting out?
It is cutting out. I understand that you're asking a question about the idea that there are groups of elites that control society.
Yes, and there seems to be a kind of a parallel in the Dogon community with the priesthood, the initiates who would only allow certain people, like the anthropologist Griol, who was initiated.
Yes, Griot.
But I think he was over a period, correct me if I'm wrong, of 10 years or something like that. And then there were those on the outside, even though they were of the Dogon society, they were not admitted or allowed in. I thought, gosh, that sounds so familiar. You know, has this always been the case for them?
Yes. The way the esoteric tradition works for the Dogon, any person can potentially learn the inner secrets of the tradition. Ultimately, there is no restriction. There's no preventing a person from arriving at the inner concepts of what the tradition is. But the requirement is that the person has to actively pursue it themselves. The student is the driving force behind understanding it. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. Topmost, from my point of view, is that it recreates the dynamic of how knowledge is passed non-materially to the material domain.
Right.
That non-materiality is not able to take action. That very often the people I know who are connected in psychic ways to non-materiality have a relationship that involves them posing a question that is then answered if it's appropriate to what their status is. I've had friends ask questions on their own behalf that they're told they won't be given an answer to, but when I ask them to pose the question on my behalf, then they're given the answer. And I've had other things happen, other situations where there are people who perceive things and understand things that I haven't been able to see.
Oh, yeah.
So whether or not the initiate receives an answer depends on posing a question that's appropriate to where you're at in terms of your understanding. Now, if the initiate does that, the informant is required to give a truthful answer. And so the initiate over time is building a body of understanding that they can count on the truthfulness of what they're being told. No one's going to lie to them in terms of important questions they're asking, as long as they do it in an orderly way.
Right.
But if I were to come from the outside into a Dogon village and sit down with a Dogon priest and say, now here, tell me about these inner secrets of your tradition. I understand this and that and the other thing. The priest is required to remain silent. And if I keep pressing, he's allowed to fib. He's allowed to tell me a lie. And if he's not certain that what I'm asking is appropriate to what I know, I can't ask it.
Yes.
So the first reason for the tradition being structured that way, in my mind, is because it trains the initiate to the mode of communication that they're going to need to understand and be comfortable with in order to continue a communication, a dialogue with non-materiality.
Right.
Now, there's another aspect to that. We can see that around 1500 BC, we know from the Old Testament that the jealous God of the Old Testament appears, and his first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, if we understand that, well, first of all, Hebrew scholars say that implies there were other quote-unquote gods before the jealous God. That very statement implies it. The Dogon had the presence of mind to ask their teachers whether they were God. And their teachers said, no, we're not God. But if it helps you to think of us as agents of God, that's okay.
Right.
So now to have the statement of the jealous God be to essentially encourage us to not pay attention to any previous gods suggests that we might have a second group that was not happy about the instruction that we were receiving of the ancient sword.
Right.
So another possible reason for secrecy in the esoteric tradition is to hide from outside eyes the fact that this instruction is going on.
Right.
I'll compare it to, we talked about the French anthropologist Marcel Griaule, who spent 30 years studying the Dogon tradition. And what he described was a closely held secret tradition of the sort I've been talking about. Well, in the 1980s, a second anthropologist from Belgium, a gentleman by the name of Walter van Beek, took a team into Dogon country and started trying to restudy what Griaule had studied. It's common in anthropology to take some aspect of a previous anthropologist's work and restudy it and reconfirm it.
Yeah.
Well, Griaule came away and said he found no evidence whatsoever in any of his contacts among the Dogon of any knowledge of a tradition such as the Dogon, as Griaule talks about.
Yeah.
My feeling is that the situation was like a parent who visits a university campus on Parents' Weekend and comes away having seen no evidence of drug or alcohol use. It's not that the drug and alcohol use wasn't going on, it's that you have a conspiracy among the people who are there to make sure that you don't see it.
Yeah.
Now, what Professor Van Beek missed was, Van Beek concluded that the Dogon priests had simply casually invented answers to all of these questions that Griaule kept asking. And rather than, he says the Dogon are very obliging people, and rather than contradict Griaule, they provided him with answers that were not truthful answers, and that he built his whole study on falsehoods. And he also said that the shrine, the Dogon shrine, which is like a stupa shrine, it's called a granary, was a form that was really only known to Griaule. He stopped short of saying that Griaule invented it, but that's what he's implying, is that he referred to it to me in an email as a chimera, known only to Griaule.
Right.
But what he missed was the abiding parallels between the Dogon shrine and a Buddhist stupa. It's built on the same base plan. It evokes a series of geometric shapes that carry the same symbolism as the Buddhist stupa. And it serves as a grand icon of the cosmology in the same way that the stupa shrine does for a matching cosmology in Buddhism. So the only way Van Beek could be correct is if we were to somehow presume that the Dogon priests casually invented Buddhism, which isn't thinkable.
No.
So having missed that fact, I was in a position to argue that the Dogon cosmology has to be a legitimate form by comparison to Buddhism. And I offered to Van Beek to co-report that with him in an article in an anthropological journal that he edited.
Right.
But he declined that. So I ended up writing an article myself for a journal called Anthropology News, where essentially I said the Dogon system has to be legitimate for those reasons.
Right.
So the idea of secrecy, there's a third reason for secrecy in the tradition. The Dogon say that their teachers felt that humanity needed to be drawn to knowledge in the same way that a moth is drawn to a flame. The Dogon compare the act of communicating knowledge to someone to the act of tugging on wild grass. They say wild grass tugs back.
Right.
And so they jokingly refer to themselves as wild grass because they understand that it's human nature to resist new information.
Yeah.
So another reason for secrecy in the tradition is that whoever put the symbolic system together understood that human consciousness, human intelligence can't resist a mystery. And so if you frame it as a mystery, if you frame it as an abiding mystery, that's a way to get people to continue to pursue it. And we see that with regard to things like pyramids in Egypt, that over many centuries, we see people continuing to ask themselves what can possibly be the truth about these pyramids.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's how I envision the whole question of secrecy of the tradition. It has several aspects to it. Those are the three main ones.
That's that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you for that answer. I see now that we've gone sort of at an hour. I just wondered whether I could just ask you one more thing, and it's about a word that is featuring an awful lot on the social media, and that word is awake. And I just wanted to ask you about that, because I was very interested to read in Seeking the Primordial that I think the Egyptians and the Dogon don't have a word for consciousness and don't have a word for awareness, but they do have a word for awake.
Right.
I was wondering, what is their understanding of awake in the Dogon? Is it different from ours?
Let's begin with a metaphor. One of the metaphors for the processes of material creation, how they begin. Non-materiality is described as a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. The processes of material creation are described as an awakening. So we have one of the mythical themes is the idea of a goddess of the waters who is asleep, and the first glow of light that precedes the dawn hovers over the waters and induces her to open her eyes and perceive the light.
Right.
And the act of perceiving the light is the metaphor for material creation.
Right.
So in that mindset of that metaphor, awakening is associated with the idea of materiality and of material consciousness.
Right.
Now, that's just the simple view of this. A more complicated view is that the dynamics of energy as they exist between non-materiality and materiality are very much the same as the dynamics of energy between the two hemispheres of a person's brain. In fact, both the scientists and the Dogon represent the concept of mass or matter using the symbol of a hemisphere. Now, when we're talking about questions of consciousness, we understand that there are several modes of consciousness that a person experiences. One of those is waking, another one is sleeping. We know that there are modes of consciousness that we cannot always proactively address or access. We know, for instance, that after a traumatic incident, that a hypnotist can often help us recall details that we couldn't consciously remember about the incident.
Right.
So those details are preserved somewhere, but in a space or in a conceptual space that we can't always immediately access. Some people can better than others. This is the same space for me as where vivid dreams live.
Right.
Now, let's talk about the Yuga cycle for the moment. The Yuga cycle is conceptualized in 4 stages. And those stages have parallelism to the 4 stages of the sleep cycle of a person. But the better parallel is actually to the sleep cycle of a dolphin. If you've ever wondered why it is that a dolphin doesn't drown when it sleeps, or you wondered if a dolphin sleeps, dolphins do sleep, but they sleep differently than we do. They experience something called unihemispheric sleep. One side of the brain goes to sleep while the other remains awake, and that's why the dolphin doesn't drown. They're just switching roles of who's awake and who's asleep.
Right.
The dynamic of the ascending cycle is a parallel, a correlate to the dynamic of sleep. Our sleep cycle ends with REM sleep. REM sleep is a situation where we have lots of activity going on in our brain as if we were awake, but we're inhibited from moving.
Yep.
Samkhya says that non-materiality has perfect knowledge, but an inability to take action. I see that as being because time is running so quickly that all events essentially happen at once, and there is no discrete moment in which to take an action.
Yep.
So we can compare a fully ascended universe, a fully ascended consciousness, to REM sleep. So from that perspective, representing consciousness as sleep makes complete sense. It's pointing us to a dynamic that we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
The Dogons say that in truth, there's no way to objectively tell which side is dreaming the other side. There's no objective way to know which is awakened consciousness and which is sleeping.
You reminded me there, if I could just interrupt, of a story. Was it Zhuang Su who said, am I the butterfly dreaming I'm a man, or am I a man dreaming I'm a butterfly? It sort of sounds similar to that. Yeah. Sorry,
Right.
carry on.
No, same idea. That's an excellent point. So Samkhya says that because it's not materiality in the when it's fully ascended for a period of, if we trust the yoga cycle definitions, for a period of 4,000 years, is fully conscious but unable to take action on its own behalf. And so consequently, there are routine attempts being made to convey knowledge to materiality or to induce action on the side of materiality through certain methods. Samkhya says the methods include synchronicities, it includes vivid dreams, the unusual behavior of animals, it includes divination, clairvoyance, and pretty much every paranormal ability that we associate with humanity falls into this category of potential efforts by the non-material side to communicate or induce action on the material side.
And this was something that...
Now looking at...
I'm sorry, this was something that people interested, the psychologist Carl Jung, as well, wasn't it? I think he spoke of what he termed, I think it was a psychoid, which was almost an in-between state of the non-material and the material.
Right. Right, and that in-between state, for me, is what transpires in that point of overlap between the two universes. I think Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism, defines three qualities of memory or knowledge. There's everyday knowledge we acquire through everyday experience. There's knowledge as it presents itself in the form of our dreams, but there's also a root knowledge that is fed by those processes, that is fed by this scrolling energy, that essentially what we experience is being seemingly being sifted, and what's pertinent from that is being permanently stored. I don't have details on that, but that's the overview that I get.
Right.
Now, in terms of the esoteric tradition, what's going on, from my point of view, is this, that we have two sides, the side that's becoming more material, which is the descending side, and the side that's becoming less material, which is the ascending side. We're scrolling mass and energy between the two universes, and the essential difference is how quickly time runs. And the greater that difference in time frame, the less ability we have on the material side to perceive things non-material. But if you think of that scrolling energy as sand in an hourglass, all of the when we turn the hourglass over, all of the sand is in the upper globe, and it's flowing down into the lower globe.
Right.
Midway through the process, it will reach a point where there's the same amount of sand in the lower globe as there is in the upper globe. And at that point, we would imagine that the time frames of the two universes equalize each other with each other.
Right.
Conceptually, that's the same as equalizing pressures between outer space and a spaceship in an airlock, or equalizing pressure between a submarine and the very pressurized water underwater under the ocean through an airlock. If you can equalize the pressure, it becomes possible to move from one domain to the other. And that's what these traditions are saying happened at around 3600 BC, which is conceptually the equinox, the midpoint of this half cycle, the descending half cycle or the ascending half cycle. Right. The midpoint happens every 6,000 years. So around 3600 BC, or at about the point of the beginning of the Hebrew calendar, we should have had a point where it became theoretically possible for non-materiality to move into materiality.
Right.
The Egyptian word for equinox is Keper. Keper is the dung beetle. And the dung beetle, the symbolism of the dung beetle is non-existence coming into existence.
Right.
If we look at Judaism, at the spring equinox, Judaism celebrates a holiday called Passover.
Yep.
In a traditional Passover Seder, the last thing they do is they open a door to the outside to allow a non-material entity named Eliyahu to enter. In other words, they're acting out the very thing that this symbolic system is saying happens at the equinox, that it becomes possible for non-materiality to enter materiality. And that's what the Dogon said their teachers did. The name of the Dogon teachers is Numo. The equivalent Egyptian term is Nu-Ma. It's a compound word. It means waves perceived. It's non-materiality suddenly taking a material form.
Right, right, right.
So now midway, or about a third of the way into the ascending cycle, the ascending consciousness realizes where the trend is headed. It's headed to a situation that if a person was in that state is called locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome involves a person who's perfectly conscious in their brain, but has no ability to move.
Yeah.
There's a very famous case called a book that was made into a movie called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, where a Frenchman suffered a stroke at the wheel of his car, and they thought he was brain dead. He had an accident. They thought he was brain dead. They took him home to care for him. All he had were random fluttering of his eyelids.
Right. Well,
after a period of time, one of his aides noticed that this wasn't just random fluttering, that there was a pattern to the fluttering. Right. And so she worked out a system by which she would step through the letters of the alphabet and ask the locked-in person to blink his eyes at a letter he wanted to pick. And he was able to spell out words that way. Eventually, he wrote the entire book, one blink at a time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so non-materiality figures out that that's where this is headed, that for a period of 4,000 years, they're effectively going to be buried alive. They're going to have no ability to act on their own behalf, but they're going to be perfectly conscious. And the only way that's not a horrific state is if the person has a compatriot.
Yeah.
Well, the only potential compatriot is the material side. Consciousness is on the material side. But unfortunately, at the same stage that non-materiality is going to be locked in, materiality is going to be its most distance from ability to even perceive that non-materiality is there.
Yeah.
So
memory slowly starts to become lost.
Right. So there's what do we do to try to preserve a compatriot for ourselves at the point where we need one? So non-materiality decides at that midpoint to cross over, send a contingent over to the material side, and establish a framework for humanity that has the potential to preserve the memory of the fact that non-materiality is there for people like us who are now at the end of that cycle. So it's essentially, go ahead.
Sorry, Avnet. Are those the teachers that you were talking about earlier then?
Yes.
Right, the mysterious teachers that are known around the globe. Yeah.
Now, yes and no, because at the equinox, at 3600 BC, that's who the teachers are. But our instruction began at 10,000 BC in the era of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. I don't know if you're familiar with the Göbekli Tepe site.
Yeah.
That era of instruction can only have come from some group that survived the end of the last half cycle and was in a position to help the rest of us out.
Right.
So non-materiality, this group of non-material teachers presents this very carefully considered structure of symbolic elements, structures for society, and so forth, with the hope. They also present this esoteric tradition whose very process is one of, it's essentially a job interview. It's essentially interviewing, trying to select out a group of wholly sincere candidates who can serve as caretakers for non-material consciousness at the point where it can't act on its own behalf. And so that's why such a high degree of sincerity and persistence is required of the initiates, is because we don't care if we only end up with a small fraction of humanity in that category. We need someone who is aware that non-materiality is there, who knows how to communicate with non-materiality, and who is able to take action on its behalf.
Yeah. Absolutely. There was something talking about teachers and, you know, those who sort of hand on or those who sort of come over to help us. I read something that kind of fascinated me, which if I could just quote it back to you so you can remember it. I'm just looking at your book at the moment. It's the, I don't know if people can see it, that's the book, Seeking the Primordial. Absolutely fantastic book.
Thank you.
Sort of read, talking about covenants, particularly the Jewish covenant or the Jewish covenant. Talk about the period 3200 BC, very close to the period you were talking about before, 3600 BC. And you say there seems to have been an implied group of figures known as the Peti or Pitai, perhaps the mythic teachers of the Dogon, and average-sized clerics known as the. When I read that, I couldn't resist the thought, that sounds terribly like the Catholic religion of Peter, the first Pope. I thought, has this kind of jumped across time? You know what I mean? We talked about time and timelessness and how things can jump back and forward. I was just struck by the similarity. Is that pure coincidence?
Well, it's not a fortuitous resemblance from my point of view. As a matter of fact, I can even identify a place and an era in which the tradition I'm talking about takes on essential forms of Christianity as one of the expressions of the later expressions of that philosophy. It happens on one of the islands of the Hebrides, where we have preserved a figure of a sleeping god. Okay, again, I'm ahead of myself. In the era of Skara Brae, around 3200 BC on Orkney, every house, every stone house, was built to the same plan.
Yeah.
Researchers on Orkney consider it to be a unique plan. They have nothing to connect it to. There is no comparable plan in any region of Europe nearby that they know of. It has unique features. That one of the unique features is a sort of what that's referred to as a beehive-shaped cell as one room. It's a round room connected to a series of rectangular rooms or square rooms. As it turns out, the Dogon in Africa normally build their houses from mud. They build mud huts. But there's also a form of stone house they build that they build from the same, using the same architectural method, the same style of construction, down to specific details of how the stones are put together, to the same architectural plan with the round room and the square rooms. For the Dogon, the plan is cosmological. It's a cosmological symbol. And what it represents is the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. The round room is her head. There are two rectangular side rooms that are her arms. There's a square central cavity that's her body cavity. There is an entryway at the bottom that's rectangular that represents her sexual parts. Now, my initial impression when I began to research these questions of connections between the Dogon, from my point of view, were essentially Egyptian at 3000 BC. So my perspective approaching the Orkney structures was that what I was seeing was Egyptian or Dogon influences on Orkney at 3200 BC.
Right.
Now, that seemed counterintuitive to me because I know that dynastic Egypt did not have enough coherence at 3200 BC to mount an expedition to Orkney and do that. After a period of time of researching the connections between the two, I realized that I had the viewpoint backwards. I was seeing Northern Scottish influences on Egypt and the Dogon.
Right.
Now, I had been confused in the first place because I noticed that when the Skara Brae houses were implemented, they had added, from my point of view, they had added a hearth in the center of the main room of the house, right where the heart ought to be. And I thought, that's interesting. They modified the plan, but they did it in a way that was in keeping with the symbolism of the house. They put the heart where the heart should be. I now realize that's completely wrong. All that happened was the house plan built in Africa, where it's much warmer, doesn't require a hearth, so they took the hearth away.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So this brings us full circle back to the concept of sleeping and awakening being central to the tradition. At 3200 BC, we see it enshrined in stone in every original house at the Skara Brae village.
There's one thing I wanted to mention to you, Laird. Last week, I suppose this is in the way of an anecdote, a personal anecdote. There was on the outside of my bathroom window, there was a spider, okay, just lodged there, and it didn't move the whole week until yesterday. Now, the interesting thing was that I would look out at the spider and thought, it's not moving. It doesn't seem to have budged. And you talk about the spider, I think it's called Nana, in your work, or Nana, and you relate it to what you call, I think it's called the dipole. Now, when I read that, I saw the picture in the Seeking the Primordial book, and it looked just like a spider, as you said in the book. And anyway, yesterday I went into the bathroom. I looked at that spider and I thought, oh my God, yeah, it's absolutely right. It looks just like that magnetic dipole that you talk about. So the Dogon seem to have this intuition or this teaching about the dipole, which is very modern scientific knowledge, isn't it? But they have it. I found fascinating.
Yes. Again, the Dogon perspective is the reason they know these things is because someone who was a master of that knowledge taught it to them.
Yes.
So it's not that the Dogon, that we can imagine the Dogon never had microscopes and telescopes and scientific equipment to be able to do this, or it's not that we should imagine that their primary mode of communication was telepathic or empathic or psychic.
Yeah.
What they're saying is, we know this because someone who understood it thoroughly taught it to us.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, the problem for a person like me is that if I were trying to speak to an academic researcher, that idea is immediately a non-starter for the academic, because it can't lead to any place that is acceptable academically to the academic researcher. There is no candidate that I can propose to have had that kind of knowledge in ancient times that an academic is going to accept. So there's absolutely no point in my trying to reconcile the work I'm doing with the academic world. What I can do is proceed with it in as careful a way as I can, and understand that if it's right, eventually others will come on board with it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the ideas that you did put forward in your book are very much according to the principle of as above, so below, and you term it as, or it's termed as parallelism. I mean, that's something that I find particularly fascinating, especially as you talk about a primordial person or a primordial being. In other words, the question is the universe itself a person or a primordial being, in a sense of as above, so below, a little bit like grand consciousness and us as the individual consciousnesses, like cells and body. Could you say a bit more about that? Because I find it fascinating.
The Dogon perspective is that the same dynamics of energy that have the potential to create material forms also have the potential to create consciousness and to create biological forms. The very parallel processes of energy do both. As a matter of fact, I came across one today. I understand as of today that the root dynamic by which memories form is also the root dynamic of magnetism. This is energy. Samkhya talks about two modes of energy that come together. Well, we know that in what I call a four-dimensional frame that we live in, again, let's back up here. Einstein presented time as if it were the fourth of four dimensions.
Yes.
Everything simplifies. In fact, nothing makes sense unless we postulate time as the first of four dimensions. It's just not a linear dimension.
Right.
Okay, so if time is the first dimension, we understand that nothing else can happen except in the context of a moment of time. If we don't have the moment of time, nothing can transpire. Yeah. So at bottom, we still have a tiny bit of mass because we can't have time without mass. And we have at least a tiny bit of energy because we can't have an oscillation of time without energy.
Yeah.
So what we're calling non-materiality isn't purely non-material. It just looks purely non-material to us.
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever tried, if you had a meter stick or a foot-long ruler, a wooden ruler, if you ever tried as a student to measure small distances using that ruler, you realize that the tool is just not adequate to the measurement you wanted to make. The markings on the ruler are not refined enough to be, and your eyesight and your physical capabilities are not refined enough to be able to mark off anything smaller than a certain size.
Yep.
Well, that's what the Planck length, which is in science is the smallest measurable length. It's proposed in our science as if this is a limit. It's not. It's not an ultimate limit. What it is a limit based on what we are able to perceive given our the pace of time as it runs for us. If we had more refined tools and a quicker time frame, we would be able to shave that vegetable in thinner and thinner slices.
Yeah.
And so what looks non-material to us, what looks like unity to us, might not actually be. We find this out with photographs, that what looks to us like a coherent image, when you magnify it, you realize it's a set of pixels. There are discrete little structures that make up what looks to us from a distance like an image. Well, that's what's going on between us and what looks to us as non-materiality. If you try to examine, oh, go ahead.
Is this a little bit like fractals then?
Yeah, it definitely is in the same domain as fractals. Now, there's a reason why mathematics, even though it looks like the best way to represent all of this, perhaps isn't the best way to represent it. If we go back to Einstein, we understand that every major discovery, every major theory that Einstein put forward was the consequence of qualitative thinking, not quantitative thinking. He would create mind scenarios for himself to think about, like what would happen if a person were tossing a ball up and down on a moving train. And he would think through what the consequences of those would have to be, and from there he derived certain principles. Well, the problem with mathematics is looking at things from a distance and knowing that from a distance the beginning of the Big Bang looks like it was what the proper term is. It was a point that had no dimensionality. It was when you use mathematics to try to quantify that, you run into problems because math can't divide by zero and it can't work with a quantity of infinity. Anything that looks like those things, the math breaks down. Right. If you approach it qualitatively instead of quantitatively, we're looking at a Big Bang where time ran 1,000,000 times quicker than it does now. There's no mathematical problem with that. We can imagine another time frame that runs 1,000,000 times quicker than that, and we still haven't bumped into a mathematical problem. These are okay. Another of the confusions about the symbolic system is that it defines a unit of measure for us. I was talking about measuring out that circle to align a Buddhist stupa shrine. Initiates were taught to measure it. Well, these were hunter-gatherers. There were no tools. We know whoever was teaching this didn't have wooden tools to hand to people to measure things with. So they had to come up with a method of measuring that any person could do. So they came up with the concept of a cubit. A cubit can either be represented as the length of your forearm, which is the distance from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, or it can be represented as the average step or pace of a person. The problem is those are relative units of measure. Those are not precise. That the distance you measure with your average pace might not be the same as the difference I measure with my average pace. That's because all of this geometry doesn't depend on preciseness of measure. It depends on relationship between figures. So when we look at these concepts, instead of using math as a construct, we use qualitative thinking as the construct.
Right.
Many of the concepts simplify, and many of the mysteries disappear. They evaporate. They go away. Because simply by looking at it from a different perspective.
Right.
Now, we were talking about as above, so below, and that relates to this concept of the cubit. One of the Dogon myths talks about how a mythological character named Ogo created the material universe. Ogo plays the role of light in the Dogon cosmological myths. The Egyptian word is Aku. It means light. It's the name of a light god in Egypt.
Right.
Now, one of the things that Ogo does is he measures out the universe in 8 billion steps. Right. Now, as soon as they use the word step, I realize somebody's talking about cubits. I know that the universe measures much greater than 8 billion cubits, but one of the figures that has been tossed about over time to represent the radius of the universe, visible universe, is 8 billion light years. And so here we have a character who plays the role of light, measuring things using a unit that it looks as if someone's trying to equate to light.
Hmm.
So is there a relationship between cubits and light years? So I go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and I look up the term for cubit, and I discover one of the words is actually a compound word again. It's aku meh. Aku is a word for light. Meh is a word for cubit or measure.
Wow.
So the Egyptian word is confirming the idea that there's a symbolic relationship between light years and cubits.
Wow.
So then I ask myself, how did we know how large an Egyptian cubit was? How did we figure that out? Well, the way they worked that out was through inference based on the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. They discovered that the base of the pyramid measures 440 cubits per side of its square base, and it measures 280 cubits high. These are royal cubits. There are two different kinds of cubits.
Yeah.
My friend Robert Bauval suggests that the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau, the large ones, are aligned in the same way as the belt stars of Orion. His outlook is that whoever built those pyramids deliberately set them to reflect the shape of the belt stars of Orion. He didn't provide us with a rationale for why they might have done that, but he noted that there's a resemblance. So working from three facts, I went to a search engine on my computer and I typed Orion, 440, and 280, and turned up references to a spiraling birthplace of stars known as Barnard's Loop, whose light is so faint you can't see it with the naked eye, but it can be imaged with time-lapse photography. And when you do image it, it centers on the belt stars of Orion.
Yeah.
More than that, the dimensions of Barnard's Loop are 440 light years by 280 light years.
That's incredible. Absolutely
Yes.
incredible.
Now, the Dogon also placed large stones on the plateau to represent stars that are important to their tradition, including specifically the belt stars of Orion. And they say the reason they placed the stones for the belt stars is to point us to a structure they call the chariot of Orion.
Yeah.
Griol, the anthropologist, interpreted that to refer to the entire constellation of Orion, for lack of anything other to relate it to.
Yeah.
But what I could see was that when you image that spiral of Barnard's Loop using time-lapse photography, you create what looks like the shape of a wheel of a chariot in which Orion the Hunter is standing.
Yeah.
So the chariot of Orion is represented by that spiral, by that wheel. Moreover, the Dogon say that spiral is to the macrocosm what a tiny spiral of matter is to matter, to the microcosm. That they describe in detail this tiny spiral that exists at every point in space and time, whose attributes are a match for Barnard's Loop scientifically. Barnard's Loop is considered to be a stellar bubble, and the way it forms and what's expected to happen over the course of its life and things like that all tie out to how the Dogon described the structure and how it forms. Right. All the symbolism lines up. So now we have a specific example of a structure in the macrocosm that is a match, a direct match, for a structure the Dogon say defines matter. We go to the Sirius stars and we discover that their interaction is a correlate to this concept I was talking about earlier, angular impulse, the crisscrossing dynamic of energy that starts off the process of material creation.
Yeah.
So now we have a second structure in the macrocosm that we can relate directly to a structure in the microcosm, as above, so below.
Yeah.
We start to understand that all of these processes, if we understand them properly, play out in parallel on all upward levels.
Yeah.
That if you have to guess about the nature of something you can't see, we can do it based on the structures we can see.
Yes. We can infer.
We can infer.
Yes.
And the Dogon call that discriminating knowledge. One of the goals of the tradition was to foster in us a facility for discriminating knowledge, which is the ability to infer something from a set of facts.
Yes.
And actually, the real power of knowledge and intelligence comes from those inferences, not from the facts. The
Yes.
facts are important, but the real leaps in understanding happen with the inferences.
Yes. Yes. How we interpret the facts.
Right.
Yeah. This has been absolutely amazing. And we thank you so much for the time that you've given to us tonight, lad. It's been absolutely wonderful. I even have, I'm just reaching over, the next book I'm going to read, which is Skara Brae. Now, I'll show you that book because that was actually with Skara Brae. You talk about Skara Brae on, I think, YouTube. That first drew us to you. And so that's a book that I definitely want to read next. So I'm going to read them all. But
well, the manuscript I'm currently finishing up that I intend to self-publish the end of this year, because it takes traditional publishers about 1.5 years to produce a book, and I'm ready to produce a second book in between. So the last 3 years I've traditionally published one book and self-published a second. Well, the one that I would intend to publish hopefully by the early weeks of November is called Tracing Orkney's Origins.
Right.
It specifically traces how the tradition got from Göbekli Tepe to northern Scotland.
Right.
And in the process of doing that, all sorts of really interesting things fall out about how these ancient cultures relate to each other, how certain symbolism came to be important, how it got expressed and where it got expressed first. Same concepts relating to that other book.
Wow. Well, I really look forward to reading that as well. And what's so wonderful is how the work that you do, and which is so fascinating, also corresponds with a lot of the work that we do but in a different way, and that's through channeling. And it's great confirmation for us as well, because it's just, honestly, I cannot put your books down. And I encourage anybody out there who's listening to this interview at the Centre of Light, please get out there, just order a book. What book would you recommend first, lad, to someone who wants to read you?
It depends on whether a person has a special interest or not, because some of the books focus on particular topics that might be of more interest to someone than another book.
Yeah.
But I have a deceased friend, a woman who was a playwright and an author, a fairly well-known one, who used to come to my conferences, and she said the thing she liked about my books was that they took her on the journey with me. And so the books are laid out that way. Essentially, my process has been from the first book till the most recent one. The growth in my knowledge is reflected in the books. So if someone is really trying to grasp the totality of that, I suggest they read them in order. If they only want to read one, it's difficult to suggest that they start with Seeking the Primordial, which is one of the books you showed, because those concepts are difficult concepts. I could suggest they start with The Science of the Dogon, which is the first book, and then move on to Seeking the Primordial, and they might have a better set of background to be able to understand the second book.
That was the order I followed, funnily enough. So I would heartily concur with that, because it certainly helped me to read The Science of the Dogon first. It gives you a grounding in what your work's about. The Seeking the Primordial is a fascinating book. Deals with more kind of abstract issues and tries to bring it all together, is how I saw it. So it is fascinating. But yes, so Led, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear what you have to say. And
well, I'm I'm always interested in hearing how other people experience things, because my own process at age 18, I would have described myself as the least energetically or spiritually connected person I knew. I had no sense of it. All the things I'm talking about, all the connections I'm talking about, were completely transparent to me at age 18. I had no idea about any of it. So I'm fascinated with how other people experience things. I find there's so many different ways that they do. If someone has a question or an issue they'd like to discuss, feel free to give out my email address or have them contact me on Facebook, and I'd be happy to hear what they have to say.
Right. Oh, thank you so much, Lad. We do hope to talk to you again if you're willing to sort of, spend time talking to us. That would be absolutely fantastic. But for today, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who listened to Led today. And wonderful. Thank you. Take care, Led. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye then.
All right.